In the aftermath of a terrible storm, there is eerie quiet. I drove through a small town that had been hit by a tornado less than an hour before. The roof was completely off one farmhouse, and what looked to have been a barn was a pile of timber and hay. Crises like a tornado, hurricanes Andrew, Katrina, or Sandy, or the Midwest floods of '93 and 2008 bring out the best and sometimes the worst in people. To be more precise for our lecture today, crises sometimes bring out the worst people. In the eerie quiet after a crisis, what type of influence agent will emerge to offer his aid? Following a series of storms on the East Coast in 2011, Dominic Sadowski and his employees from Precision Builders, a Camden, New Jersey firm, would visit neighbors and knock on doors. They'd go into homes and offer to do free inspections and explain that anything they did would be covered by insurance. Sadowski sold his services by presenting himself as a hero, there to save the day. The real truth was that Sadowski and his crew were criminals. In some cases, they would inspect homes that were undamaged and actually create damage with their tools. This is why Sadowski was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 4 years probation and 100 hours of community service. In other similar cases, contractors offer great deals, take deposit money, and then disappear, never to return. Following Hurricanes Rita and Katrina, researchers at Louisiana State University estimated that over 9,000 households were subject to some type of contractor fraud. Contractors like Sadowski are using a very old bag of tricks that we often label the con game. Con games, or confidence games, involve a simple sequence of gaining someone's confidence and then exploiting it for personal gain. The con is deeply ingrained in popular culture with movies like The Music Man, written by Iowa's very own Meredith Willson, starring Robert Preston. The Sting, starring Newman and Redford. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Steve Martin and Michael Caine. And Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo DiCaprio. Each movie captures the exploits of a charming criminal or two who get their way with smiles and lies. We have a love-hate relationship with con artists. It's hard not to like the characters played by Preston and DiCaprio. They're protagonists of these movies, aren't they? But in real life, con artists are not heroes. There's something about them that has led them to refine and improve their influence skills and then use them to take advantage of other people. In our last lecture, we talked about the positive characteristics of agents that help them to be persuasive. In this lecture, we'll delve into negative characteristics that lead people to use persuasion to exploit others. We're going to explore what makes someone a con artist and how such a person is different than a skilled ethical persuader. Before we go further, let me preview the key takeaway. Research has confirmed what is now being called the dark triad of personality characteristics. And people with these characteristics are more likely to lie, cheat, and steal from others. In the context of influence, these particular types of people are more likely to have harmful motives and use deceitful methods. Clearly, it's helpful to know more about such people so you don't get lied to, cheated on, and stolen from. But before we talk about the dark triad, I want to tell you another story. In November 2008, Bernie Madoff was on top of the world. Head of a family-run investment business, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, he had clients all over the world, including movie stars like Keira Sedgwick, Kevin Bacon, former talk show host Larry King, and even former baseball great Sandy Koufax. His firm had pioneered the use of software for stock trading. He later served on the NASDAQ Board of Governors and served on the board of directors for the Securities Industry Association. This was a man who'd been at the center of Wall Street for decades. But on June 29, 2009, Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison for running what has become one of the biggest financial frauds in U.S. history. What did Madoff do, and how did he do it? And perhaps most relevant for our purposes in this lecture, why did he do it? It turns out that Madoff was running what has become known as a Ponzi scheme. The scheme is named for a gentleman, Charles Ponzi, who in the 1920s attracted investors with a promised high rate of return, 50%, and propped up that lie by paying his earliest investors with money from the new investors. The scheme worked up until Ponzi ran out of new investors. In his version of the Ponzi scheme, Bernie Madoff falsified investment records so they indicated dramatic returns. In actuality, he was doing what Ponzi did, paying old investors with new investors' money, spending original deposits to fund an extravagant personal lifestyle. At the time of his indictment, Madoff had an investment portfolio that, on paper, and in his account statements to those investors, said was worth $64.8 billion. To put this in perspective, this is larger than the gross domestic product of quite a few countries. A bit less than Ecuador, but more than Luxembourg, for example. So on paper, Madoff was running a small country. But how much real money was in the accounts? According to Irving Picard, the trustee appointed by the court to liquidate the accounts and pay back investors whatever he could, the amount of money invested in Madoff's fund was $36 billion, only a little more than half of what the records said. So as a start, Madoff lied to many people about how much money they actually had in their investment accounts. Now, on top of that, about half of what actually went into the fund was simply gone. That's $18 billion spent on houses, apartments, boats, art, and some other things that Picard could not even trace. Who did Madoff lie to? Whose money did he spend? New York Magazine profiled the victims, and they included famous people like Steven Spielberg and Kevin Bacon, but the list also included regular people who lost their entire life savings. Phyllis Machatsky, for example, worked a long career as a manager and put away money whenever she could, eventually putting it all into the fund run by Madoff. On paper, as she neared retirement, she had $3.8 million. Once the scandal broke, she had nothing. Her whole life savings was gone. Madoff is a great example of someone with a personality that combines charm and influence with a callous disregard for others. Among many different types of personality characteristics, there are three that are particularly central to this type of behavior: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Researchers refer to these as the dark triad of personality. Each of these three personality traits is somewhat distinct, and as I will note, research suggests that each can lead some people to do harm with their use of influence. Let's first look at Machiavellianism, which is named for the Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. Individuals who score high in Machiavellianism tend to be the kind who manipulate others for their own gain. A team of European researchers designed an interesting experiment that captures Machiavellianism in action. Participants in this experiment were given an opportunity to play a game where they rotated between playing against a computer and playing against a person. In both conditions, participants decided how much money from a designated pot they would share with their partner, again, either a person or a computer. Now, if the partner thought the amount of money offered to them wasn't fair, the game was structured so that they could choose to punish the participants and reduce how much money they got to keep. In other words, the partner was given leeway to take revenge if she became angry with how stingy the research participant was being. Of course, when the playing partner was a computer, it would take whatever money was given gladly and not hold a grudge. Computers are convenient like that. But when the partner was a person, well, that was another story. How do you win at this game? Who gets the most money? Well, the people who earn the most in this game are those who pay just enough to human partners on rounds where the human partner is playing, and they quickly switch strategy to paying as little as possible when the computer's playing. It takes a little thought and strategizing to win big in this game. And can you guess who did best? People higher in Machiavellian personality withheld more money in the trials with the computer and gave just enough when they were playing against people to avoid being punished. Adding up across all trials, higher Machiavellians earned the most. They figured out the system, were ruthless when it worked against that unfeeling computer, but played nice when it was necessary against the person who could punish them. Just as interesting in this particular study were imaging results from the brains of participants. These participants actually played while they were in an MRI machine. The MRI results, the pictures of their brains, indicate that those high in Machiavellianism had significant brain activity in a brain region associated with concern for punishment. Machiavellians are highly sensitive to punishment. So in the experiment, they acted with smart restraint when punishment was a factor. But when punishment was not, they were working, their brain activity was going, they kept all they could. Think about it this way. Keep an eye on someone like this, and they'll play nice. Turn your back, and who knows what they might do in pursuit of their own self-interest. Now that I describe it that way, I realize I live with a Machiavellian personality. Lola is the best behaved dog when she knows you're watching. But turn your back. She's on the table eating the Thanksgiving turkey. Probably should have called her Mock. Peter Jonason and Gregory Webster, two scholars who've studied the dark triad extensively, sought to boil down all measures of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy into a short, easily administered survey. They settled, after much research, on 12 simple statements that allow us to scale people from low to high along these dimensions. Here are two of the statements that they use to measure Machiavellianism. I tend to manipulate others to get my way. I have used deceit or lied to get my way. Moving to the second of the dark triad characteristics, we come to narcissism. This personality trait means that someone is profoundly self-centered, which leads to extravagantly self-serving behavior. Rather than talk about a research study for narcissism, I'd like to return to Bernie Madoff. Last we left him, he was sitting in a federal penitentiary. In an interview with Barbara Walters, he was asked what he thinks about all this negative publicity he received. Does he understand why, and does he regret what he has done? Quote, I understand why clients hate me. The gravy train is over, he said. I can live with that. He went on. The average person thinks I robbed widows and orphans, he added. I made wealthy people wealthier. Now, notice the pattern of quotes here. Despite his outright lies overall, he excuses it and frames what he did positively. He helped people. One measure of narcissism used in management studies is the number of times an executive uses the first person in speeches. In these quotes from the Walters interview, Madoff uses I frequently. And he also tries to present what he did, the lying, the cheating, the stealing, somehow in a positive light. Remember the truth, though. Madoff only made money for people who were smart enough to withdraw their money in time. In other words, if they were Machiavellian and didn't trust him, they probably made money with him. But then Madoff left many people holding nothing. So who benefited from this gravy train that Madoff created? Bernie Madoff, of course. The use of I and unconditional positive self-regard of narcissists overall reminds me of another business leader, Donald Trump. Trump likes to be the center of attention and finds many ways to make that happen, even if they have nothing at all to do with his business dealings. Perhaps most obvious is his habit of naming things after himself. On the first floor of Trump Tower in New York, there's a breakfast place called Trump Cafe. When Trump opened Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago, he made sure there was an outstanding outdoor bar. Its name, The Terrace at Trump. Now, while you're there, if you visit, make sure to use your Trump card so you can earn points toward further Trump attaché services. Jonason and Webster, who built that dark triad survey, used the following two statements to measure narcissism. I tend to want others to admire me. I tend to want others to pay attention to me. The third and final of the dark triad characteristics is psychopathy. Psychopathy is present when someone has little concern for others and their welfare. When we hear this word, though, we often imagine a serial killer, knife in hand, sneaking up on an unsuspecting victim. The reality is far less dramatic. Most people who display signs of psychopathy are not violent, and very few ever commit violent crime. The more accurate depiction of the psychopath is the rare individual who's not particularly concerned about the feelings or welfare of others. This lack of empathy means that those individuals have fewer constraints on their behavior, so they're more likely to end up doing mean or hurtful things. This particular trait has been studied in detail by Professor Robert Hare, who developed a clinical checklist that's commonly used to diagnose psychopathy. I should note, by the way, that the term psychopathy is not recognized by psychiatrists, who prefer the term antisocial personality disorder. But in social and organizational psychology, the term psychopathy is very much part of the research vocabulary. While we're clearing up details, I should note that Hare conceptualizes psychopathy to include narcissism, but this is really a matter of how one prefers to slice the pie of dysfunctional personalities. More often, when someone displays one, they display the others, the whole pie as well. In a 2011 book about Hare's checklist called The Psychopath Test, author John Ronson describes his journey to Florida, where he meets Al Dunlap, the former CEO of Sunbeam. Ronson was interested to explore whether Dunlap met the criteria on Hare's checklist of a psychopathic personality. Upon arriving at the home, Ronson looked around, and he noted that Dunlap had a particular theme to his decorating. Dunlap's home was adorned with statues and paintings of lions and eagles and all types of predators. In an interview with Ronson, Dunlap explains that he believes in carnivores. His record at Sunbeam, which involved a series of ruthless decisions to fire people, leading to the nickname Chainsaw Al, seems to support the idea that he likes carnivores. Dunlap, for the record, also engaged in shady accounting practices that artificially boosted Sunbeam's stock price. Although Dunlap fit many of the characteristics on Hare's checklist, he didn't fit all of them, and he certainly denies being a psychopath because, he says, he does feel sadness and remorse, such as when his dog died when he was a kid. Although, if you listen carefully to his interview, as described by Ronson, it's easy to wonder just how much remorse he feels. Certainly, Dunlap continues to feel justified in making ruthless and sometimes unethical decisions in the context of helping Sunbeam return to profitability. In the end, however, Sunbeam ended up in bankruptcy because of the questionable business and accounting practices that Dunlap supported. So as with Bernie Madoff, the primary beneficiary of Dunlap's behavior was Dunlap himself, or those lucky individuals who did not trust him and sold all their stock before the truth came to light. Peter Jonason and Gregory Webster's statements to measure psychopathy are, I tend to lack remorse, and I tend to be callous or insensitive. In Al Dunlap, we actually see all of the quintessential elements of the dark triad: a desire to win at all costs, Machiavellianism; high self-regard, narcissism; and a disregard for others, psychopathy. The dark triad offers insights into the question about the differences between ethical and unethical use of persuasion. Individuals high on dark triad traits are much more likely than anyone else to employ deception, lies, and trickery in their attempts to influence. As I said before, being aware that there are people like this can help us avoid being the next victim of theft or fraud. While discussing the dark triad, you probably noticed that the examples so far have all been men. Is it the case that only men exhibit these characteristics, and that only men engage in the types of influence attempts, deceitful and manipulative, that the dark triad engenders? To find out, let's turn to a 2012 study authored by Peter Jonassen, Sarah Slomsky, and Jamie Partyka. Not surprisingly, this study found that people high in narcissism and Machiavellianism tend to more frequently use hard influence tactics, those tactics that involve demands and threats to get what you want. In contrast, soft tactics involve using appeals to logic or emotion. We'll discuss these in more detail in a subsequent lecture. Jonas and his colleagues also found that men use more hard tactics than women. Now, why is that the case? Well, they found that more men than women were high in the dark triad traits. So the answer to the question, do only men exhibit these traits, is no, but there are certainly more men than women who fit the scary dark triad profile, and they're more likely to use hard tactics. So far, we've been discussing the dark triad in reference to the agent, the person who attempts to influence others. But when we look at the harmful ways that dark triad personalities can influence other people, it's important to look at the other components of our ADDIC framework as well. Do target, tactics, and context also contribute to the success of a con? To answer that, let's turn to a 2007 paper entitled The Toxic Triangle. In this paper, authors Art Padilla, Bob Hogan, and Robert Kaiser used the term destructive leadership to explain what happens when there's a poisonous combination of agent, target, and context. Professor Padilla and his colleagues use Fidel Castro as an example. Castro did some positive things for Cuba, but in his time as the longest-serving dictator in modern history, he also engaged in campaigns to imprison and kill those who opposed him. He was famous for long, rambling speeches that focused on himself more than the issues. Even at a young age, Castro was seen as idealistic and bold and quite skilled at self-promotion. He also came to hate the United States and everything it stood for. So here we have a narcissistic agent who espouses an ideology of hate. That's the quintessential agent profile for a destructive leader. But how could such a leader come to and stay in power? The answer is in context. At the time of the Cuban Communist Revolution, many, although certainly not all citizens in Cuba, were ready for a charismatic leader promising reform and power to the people. The troubled economic and political atmosphere of the time, marked by intense poverty and corruption, made a strong leader, a strong principled leader like Castro, far more compelling than any alternative. Many of the people who stood to lose the most, the middle class, fled the country, so the relative number of supportive followers was increased. So both the target and the context were conducive to Castro's emergence as a powerful leader. While it is not at all clear whether, historically, Castro's rise could have been avoided, it's useful to consider that certain targets of influence and certain contexts favor bold, risk-taking, and potentially destructive leaders. Awareness of this fact may be useful in helping opponents rally support against such leaders. preventing them from using influence tactics to gain too much power, which they will be likely to abuse. As we wrap up this lecture, it's worth reminding ourselves that the world is not often as black and white as we might like it to be. The dark triad exists along a continuum, as does the ethicality of any particular influence effort. Certainly we can agree that using your likability to influence voters to endorse a traffic intersection redesign that saves lives is good. And surely we agree that using blatant lies drawn from a Machiavellian desire to cheat is bad. But what about the sales pitch that involves no overt lie, just an omission of some detail to help structure the most compelling argument and get the sale? I recently bought a piece of technology that has 3 features I like, and I actually told the sales rep about each of them and why I wanted them. Now, the sales rep knew me, and he knew what other technology I owned, and he knew that one of those features would not work with my technology setup, but he failed to mention that fact. I learned it for myself less than an hour later. And here we enter the gray between the black and white. The salesperson's omission helped get that sale, but it has reduced my trust in him and in that store. As we get further into the course, I'm not going to dig into the philosophical issues that would help us explore the boundaries between good and bad, but I will take a particular stance as it relates to influence and ethics. I believe there is a line between the effective ethical persuader and the con man. The con man's influence efforts are characterized by 2 things: malice and misinformation. This captures both motive, desire to win at others' expense, and method, an outcome pursued at any cost. The ethical persuader will have both a socially beneficial motive and an ethical approach that involves accurate information. She will strive to accomplish goals that benefit more than just herself and do so in a way that's honest. Some of the tools that she uses may in other ways look the same as the con man. But the difference in motive and the willingness to use accurate information must be present for influence to be ethical. Another important difference between an ethical persuader and a con artist is their perspective. Con artists focus on the here and now, and they'll use any tactic at their disposal to get their way right away. Ethical persuaders take the long view. They work to develop trusting relationships that set the stage for later influence. In this lecture, we've explored the dark side of influence. We've seen that agents who have narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic personality traits are likely to influence others in ways that involve lying, cheating, and stealing. But if we know these people are out there, how can we avoid becoming a victim? It's quite difficult to detect these people because some of them can be very charming. But I will offer 2 tips. First, don't believe someone who offers you something that is too good to be true. Money for nothing. A product substantially better than all of the competitors, but somehow cheaper. A magical service that does absolutely everything you need. These are things you should be suspicious of. Well, I don't want you to be on the lookout and distrusting all the time. It is useful to practice skepticism. You can practice being a skeptic by looking for suspicious claims in newspapers, television, and websites. One common one is the claim by nutritional supplements to prevent disease. Most of these claims have not been independently verified by scientists. And the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does not heavily regulate it, at least for now, ads for nutritional supplements. We all want to believe that a single small pill, once a day, will prevent a heart attack or cure arthritis. But it's just not likely to be true, given the variety of factors that influence these health conditions. Talk to a few people and look for evidence elsewhere before buying. The second thing you can try is this. adopt the advice contained in a Russian proverb: trust, but verify. In negotiations with the Soviet Union in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan used this phrase frequently and publicly. It's also advice that is often followed by investigative reporters seeking to get to the bottom of a great story. I caution against overusing this as an approach to life because it'll make you unhappy if you're thinking everyone's out to get you. But the next time someone you don't know tries to gain your confidence, maybe to get your money, double-check the story. If it's an email, see if you can verify the source and the nature of the email from an independent source. Don't click on any links from any unsolicited emails. If you're interested, because it sounds like a good deal, do an independent online search to see if others have reported that email as a fraud. If it's your investment advisor sending you news, ask for specific transaction records and a full explanation of your gains, not just your losses. Can you verify the numbers you're being shown from a second source? When we hear what we want to hear, it's easy to not be critical, but often, as in the case of Bernie Madoff's clients, that's exactly when we need to be. In these last two lectures, we've talked about agent characteristics, the positive and the negative. In the next lecture, we'll move from agent to target and talk about the characteristics of targets that make them more susceptible to influence from both con artists and ethical persuaders.